This is Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. Do you like Congress? What they're doing, how they operate, who is in there? If you said yes, you are part of a very small minority of Americans. Most of us, across party lines, are not fans of pretty much anything happening in our federal legislature. Congress is unproductive, it's full of long-term residents who don't seem compelled to get much done, and in some cases they age into very public dysfunction. So you'll often hear term limits suggested as a place to start, to get fresh eyes and ears in our halls of government. But this wouldn't be a Hear Me Out episode if we didn't pose the question, what if that supposed solution actually made things worse?
Using term limits to fix these problems, in my view, would be like trying to fix a leaky pipe by smashing it with a hammer. This is a reform that does not fit the problems that we're talking about.
Professor Charlie Hunt of Boise State University joins us in just a moment.
Sign up to The Economist for in-depth curated expert analysis of world events and topics ranging from business and culture to science and technology. You'll get the weekly digital edition, online-only articles, curated newsletters on politics, the markets, science, culture, and China, and full access to The Economist Podcast Plus. The Economist is independent journalism for independent thinking. Go to economist.com and get your first month free.
Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. We've talked before in the show about the myriad ways that Congress is broken. Only 16% of us approve of the job Congress is doing. That's near a historic low and frankly higher than I expected. Both conservatives and liberals often suggest term limits as a simple solution. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida has called for them, but so have Democratic legislators in both the Senate and the House. Now, not surprisingly, some say term limits will not help, and career legislators who've spent decades upon decades on Capitol Hill are particularly prone to hate the idea. But you may not know that there's a contingency of political scientists who also worry that term limits could make things worse and not better. One of those scholars is Charlie Hunt, a professor at Boise State University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Celeste.
So for those who don't know you, tell us what you do.
Sure. I'm an assistant professor of political science in the School of Public Service at Boise State. I teach and I research mainly in the area of Congress. I also touch on state politics and partisanship and polarization. So this is kind of my territory. I co-authored a textbook on Congress with my grad school partner in crime, Casey Burgett, over at George Washington. That textbook is called Congress Explained. And so, term limits is some of the ocean I've been swimming in for a while here, because we deal a lot in reforms and how to make Congress better. Because as you said, Celeste, not too many Americans are hot on Congress right now. So I'm all for different ways to try and fix it. It's just my view that term limits just ain't it.
I mean, as a journalist, I'm always thankful for Congress because we always have a higher approval rating than they do. So at least there's somebody beneath us. But let's go into what your opinion is. I mean, I want to be clear that you're talking specifically about the federal Congress, correct? Because there's already term limits in a couple dozen states at least. There's already term limits for the executive branch. But you're talking specifically about the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, correct?
Yeah, that's right, Celeste. So, Congress is the institution that tends to be least popular here. And, they're often put forward, term limits are, as sort of a potential cure for polarization, right? People's problem with Congress, for the most part, seems to be that it's really polarized, that Democrats and Republicans can't get along, that they're really unproductive. And this is leading to these kinds of dismal approval ratings. And yet, members of Congress keep getting reelected at really high rates. Something, 95, 97% of members of Congress who run for reelection get reelected. And so there's this perspective, right, that elections for Congress aren't working the way we want them to. So instead, we need to sort of force members out with term limits and just start over, right? But there are a few problems with that. So, for one thing, incumbents do have some advantages, but political science at this point mostly says that this advantage isn't because of incumbency itself. It's because of how one-sided, right, how red or blue most of our districts and states are. So if you have a district that's mostly Republican voters, it's probably going to elect a Republican, okay? And these issues of, partisanship, gerrymandering falls in here, sort of the natural sorting of voters into these one-sided districts. These are all problems that it doesn't seem clear term limits will do anything to solve, okay? And so, if you have term limits, you're going to get newer legislators, right? Because the old ones are going to be forced out. But they're going to tend to be more ideologically extreme than the people there that are replacing them through elections, right? So term limits would probably not give us folks who are, willing to compromise or who are more bipartisan. It's going to give us the kinds of folks who maybe we think of as the newer members of Congress who most people think of, your Matt Gaetzes, right? Your Ilhan Omar's, your Lauren Boeberts. And I don't mean to draw a false equivalence between all those folks, but just as a few examples. And you mentioned, Celeste, that the state legislatures have term limits, and they do. But, political scientists, so for example, Michael Olson and John Rogowski wrote sort of a classic paper in this area, classic to me anyway, that have found exactly this pattern, that state legislatures that instituted term limits in the late 90s and early 2000s saw afterwards bigger gaps between Democrats and Republicans and more polarization than the legislatures that did not institute term limits.
Okay, so first of all, I think that as classic as that paper may be, I haven't read it, but it could be a problem of correlation versus causation, because I think that the polarization that we're seeing today was always going to be on the rise for a number of different reasons. A, the increasing influence of lobbyists and money in our politics. B, as you said, gerrymandering, which is at this point at just a ridiculous level, at such a level that it's hard for me to imagine that we're really a representative democracy at this point.
Right.
There are so many things influencing and driving polarization in this country that I feel like we have to uncouple term limits from them because we can't fairly say they are causing that. A lot of democracies around the world have term limits. People who are experts in autocracy say that when someone tries to exceed term limits, it's a really good sign that they're planning a coup.
Right.
We have term limits for president for a reason. Many governors have term limits. I think it's unfair to say that term limits are driving polarization.
I totally hear that, and I'm 100% in favor of term limits for executive figures like presidents who have, phenomenally more power than any individual member of Congress, right? If we're talking about the House of Representatives, we're talking one of 435 members. I'm sensitive to those arguments for sure. And I don't think by any means that term limits, as instituted in state legislatures, are by any means the main cause of polarization. But for sure, what I can say, with about as much confidence as anything in political science, is that term limits, at the very least, have no effect on polarization. And so as they're proposed as a sort of way of reducing polarization, they're just not going to be that cure, right? Generally, right, it seems to me like term limits, at least for Congress, again, like you said, we're talking about Congress, that this is a reform that's sort of designed to make us feel better rather than actually fix the problem, okay? And people say, well, incumbents get reelected constantly and they're not doing the job we want, so we need term limits. Another way to say this is that the voters of most districts like their representatives well enough to reelect them constantly, right? So term limits are, one criticism here is that term limits are a way of saying voters can't be trusted. Now, I don't know if I totally buy into that. I think there are plenty of problems with our elections that are giving us these kinds of legislators that we're really not happy with. So I don't totally buy into that criticism of term limits. But again, if the problem is with how our elections are conducted or the way our districts are drawn through gerrymandering, let's fix that, right? Using term limits would be, to fix these problems, in my view, would be like trying to fix a leaky pipe by smashing it with a hammer. That this is a reform that does not fit the problems that we're we're talking about. So if the problem is autocracy and the looming threat of autocracy, totally makes sense for offices like president. But for Congress, if our problem is they can't get along, they're too polarized, they're too extreme, they're yelling at each other all the time, term limits, most of the evidence says that you're either going to get no change or you may even get even more extreme legislators coming in. And that's exactly what some of the analyses that other political scientists have done and what I have done have found, that newer legislators tend to be more extreme, and term limits are only going to accelerate that turnover process.
So I want to talk a little later about this idea that the experience on the job means you get more done. But first, let's go to go back to the idea that term limits are super popular. I mean, I think it's a reflection of the fact that our political system is so broken at this point that something this popular, just like reasonable gun legislation or abortion access, which are also wildly popular among the American public, the fact that we can't get that passed in Congress, to me, is a sign of its just crippling dysfunction. Because there are a lot of people like Ted Cruz who say they support term limits, and then he's running for his third term
right.
in 2024. Right. But here's the thing. One of these arguments is that the vast majority, 90% of Republicans, 88% of independents, 84% of Democrats agree that at this point, because we have this broken political system, incumbents are so secure, they are not responsive to their constituents. Right. They completely only pay attention to the dictates of the leaders in their political parties, and they don't have to worry about what their constituents want. In fact, you see their voting record often flies in the face of what their constituents want.
Mm-hmm. So I totally agree, Celeste, with everything you have just said. My problem is that term limits would do nothing to help that. So Matt Gaetz, right, our favorite punching bag in Congress these days, right? And for good reason.
For very good reason.
Yeah, he's out there in a very Republican district in Florida. Let's say we term limit him. I think he started serving in 2017. He'd be coming up on 8 years soon. That's a typical term limit length. So at the end of the next Congress, let's say he's term limited, he has to go. He can't get reelected. He's in a really Republican district. Is he going to get replaced with some, super moderate Republican who's going to be really bipartisan? No, probably not. Now if we have elections, he'll probably be reelected, and so maybe that's not great either. But the high reelection rates for incumbents, the advantage that they have, is much more due to these structural factors about how partisan our districts are, right? And so term limits, we talked before about how, 80-some% of the American public doesn't think Congress is doing a good job. Well, that's about the percentage of the American public that wants term limits, right? This sort of thirst for term limits is coming from really understandable, deep dissatisfaction with Congress that I share. And I say this as someone who unironically loves Congress. I think it needs to be a good institution. Like, we need Congress to work. And so... Yeah. And so it's coming from a good place, but all of the advantages that come with incumbency are less so from being an incumbent itself. It's from the underlying structural issues of these districts. And so if you get rid of these members with term limits, it is increasingly unlikely that they're going to get replaced with someone who's going to sort of solve these problems.
So we're going to continue this conversation because there is so much to talk about here. I will mention, though, that I don't know how old you are, Charlie, but I would imagine neither of us is old enough to have seen a Congress that works. So I don't know what that looks like. But we will return in just a moment. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the hotter, juicier classic burgers. Mr. Hamburglar. Robble, robble. He said, of all the McDonald's burgers I've ever hamburgled, these are the hottest, juiciest, and tastiest. Robble.
Hamburglary is on the rise. Get caught with a medium double cheeseburger meal for $6. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal price. Comparison to prior classic burgers.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
We're back. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headley, and we're talking about term limits. We have a political scientist with us who says, despite the popularity of the idea, it wouldn't actually work. So, famously, Ronald Reagan at one point said the only experience you need in politics is how to be political. Like, I think that if we changed the paradigm in Congress, if seniority was not the only thing that gave you power, then people would figure out how to get things done under the new system. They would have to, and so they would. I mean, to argue that seniority is the way that people get things done would also be to say, because we have so many people who've been in both the House and the Senate for such a long time, well, I would have to be able to look at the Congress and say, okay, look, all these people who've been there forever are getting things done. They're not. You know they're not. But the way that it is right now is that if you vote in a better member, they have no power. They will always be behind Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or whomever has power there. I think that if you have term limits, you're going to end up having to cycle through some people who are just regular folks who have regular jobs, and it might actually become a little bit more representative. And it is, after all, and instead of these career politicians who know that once they get a seat in Congress or the Senate, they're pretty much set for life. You can even have horrifying charges laid against you by law enforcement and still be reelected. I mean, that's no way to govern a country.
I totally hear that, Celeste. I think my issue with this falls on a couple of fronts. So, institutional memory matters, not just for Congress, but for any organization, right? I did this data analysis of these, newer members of Congress versus folks who have been there for a long time. And the Center for Effective Lawmaking, which is a research center run by some of my fellow political scientists at Vanderbilt and UVA, they calculate these legislative effectiveness scores based on the bills legislators introduce, the amount of effort they're putting in, how far these bills get in the legislative process, and how effective individual legislators are at passing these bills and advocating their priorities. And to your point, right, across the board, newer legislators are and have always been much less effective at lawmaking. And we can imagine why, right? They have less experience in the policy areas that they might want to work. And this isn't their fault, right? They're new members of Congress. I'm not trying to blame them, specifically. But they also aren't as intimately familiar with the legislative process in Congress, and so they aren't as skilled at navigating those procedures. They also have not had the time to build up the relationships with other members that study after study shows that are absolutely necessary for lawmaking success, right? This is, of course, not to say that newer legislators can't be good lawmakers. Of course they can. But giving members time to build out these skills and relationships are just going to make them better at their jobs like any other jobs. And I do want to add one point about, we mentioned earlier the influence of special interests and lobbyists, and that, career politicians can become sort of entrenched here. One potential danger with term limits is that by putting a sort of a ticking clock on the amount of time that a member has to serve in Congress, they are going to be thinking not about what they're doing in Congress. They're going to be thinking about what's next. And they're going to be thinking about, well, how am I going to turn this experience I have now into a job, right? As a lobbyist, as, the head of a special interest group. And that's a danger too, right? Of course, career politicians become stuck in their ways, right? We need fresh ideas from newer members. But again, maybe another unpopular opinion here, but career politician is could be another way of saying, a career dedicated to public service as a member of Congress. We think about them as career politicians because we hate Congress, and that's sort of a bad word we can throw at them. But we should want people to run for Congress. We should want people to be good members of Congress. And if they're good, we should want them to stay in there as long as possible. And putting in term limits takes the choice away from voters for keeping in someone who's doing a really good job. And so that's part of my perspective on the issue, is that yes, maybe you are sort of pushing out some of the folks who are a little bit past their prime, maybe, but you're also risking throwing in a bunch of really good members with that as well and having a really good Congress.
So, I mean, I hear everything that you're saying, but I got to say, all members of Congress, you're even somebody who's been in Congress for 12 years, a doctor seeing patients has a better handle on healthcare policy than one of the members of Congress. I've interviewed them. They don't know what they're voting on. They admit they don't read the bills. They have staff members who do that. And I would argue that if we had term limits with new Congress people coming in, it doesn't have to be really short-term limits, right? The average, I think maybe a little over 43% of the Senate has been there for more than 12 years. Like, we're already kind of have a de facto term limit in that, not everyone is Strom Thurmond there for 47 years. But I would argue that then, by necessity, the responsibility of knowing how everything works would shift to their staff, which is where it mostly is now anyway. And often the people who work on Capitol Hill as aides and advisors are there for their entire careers. But when you have career politicians, we're not talking about people who know the issues better. We're not talking about people who have become really skilled in reading a budget bill and truly understanding it. That's rarely the case. What we're talking about are the majority of Congress members who are millionaires, who didn't come into Congress as millionaires, but are now. And that's
I dispute that a little bit, Celeste. Many members of Congress are millionaires, and newer members of Congress are just as likely to be wealthy as older members of Congress. That's a separate issue, I think.
But you also, if you look at their income over time, you can see that their income increases all out of proportion to their salary. Plus, we are keeping people in there who have no realistic idea of what it is to actually be without health care benefits, what it is to actually have to live on any kind of living wage. Once they get into Congress, they're set for life, for the most part, in general, and they never have to worry about real world people anymore. And I think that getting people in there on a regular basis who are coming from a regular job is a much better idea than bringing in wealthy people. And I agree. Well, term limits aren't the panacea. Yeah. There's lots of reforms that have to happen. I totally agree. But I
hear you,
I feel like it should be one of them.
But I have no reason to believe, and I don't think we have any evidence to support the idea that if we put in term limits, the new members of Congress coming in are automatically just going to be like regular Joes and Jills, right? That I don't see why term limits would change that paradigm. That the people coming in are and there are reasons that the people coming in tend to be really wealthy, tend to be millionaires. It's because to win these elections, you need really good networks, you need a lot of money, you need a lot of contacts. Usually people are coming from these white-collar jobs. I couldn't agree more that we need a more sort of evenly distributed set of occupations in Congress to bring these important experiences to the foreground. But to me, putting in term limits to facilitate that, again, is the wrong tool for the job, right? We need to have more fundamental changes to how our campaigns are run. We need different campaign finance laws. These are the things that are going to be more likely to affect that. Whereas if you put in term limits, you're just going to, in my view, you're much more likely to just be replacing old millionaires with young millionaires. And that's, I feel like it's a sort of a too simple solution to that problem, where we need more fundamental changes to fix some of these other core things that people really don't like about Congress. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, I think it could be yes and, Charlie. I mean, we obviously need all of these, all of the reform you're talking about. We got to take care of gerrymandering. We shouldn't have politicians deciding what the boundaries of a legislative district are. We need to deal with the the money that's flooding into our system and get rid of the idea that corporations are people. But I think we can also have some kind of limit. I mean, at this point, there's very little generational diversity in Congress. There are so many members that are like 40, 50 years old. And in the Senate, I think the average age is 60, maybe. I'm not looking at it, but it's high. As a Gen Xer, I don't have a lot of reputation, I don't have a lot of representation because the baby boomers are sitting in their congressional seats and their Senate seats and not getting out. And most of the new people are like AOC, a millennial. So we got skipped entirely. We've never even had a president or vice president. So and also look at the problem we have with people like not just Strom Thurmond, but we've had issues with people who are staying in those seats well beyond their ability to serve. And I won't name names, but I think everyone can come up with them. So at least can't we have age limits?
Yeah, so I think this is a different and I think interesting question, right? So age limits, I think, would accomplish this better than term limits, right? So, for example, the current front runner to win over Joe Manchin's seat in the Senate next time around is Republican Jim Justice. He was the governor of West Virginia. If he's elected later this year, he's going to be 74 years old when he's sworn in for his first term, right?
Yeah, he was born in 1951.
Yeah, 2 Senate terms would get him to 86. 3 would get him to 92, right? So, as far as term limits being, I think part of their attraction also is as a potential solution for this age issue, right? You won't name names, but I will, right? Mitch McConnell, Dianne Feinstein, these other folks, right? Term limits are in no way a guarantee for dealing with the age issue if we think that's an issue, and I do think it's something that we need to be thinking about, right? And so age limits would be more precise. I don't know if I'm in favor of those either, but at least we have precedent for them in Congress, right? Because we have age floors. We say no one under 25 can serve in the House, no one under 30 can serve in the Senate. And I'm with you on getting more age diversity in Congress. I hope that I'm a millennial. I'm hopeful that we can band together a little bit against the boomers and have some nice generational warfare here. But that is a huge problem. But again, I mean, parties keep nominating really old folks as well, and they have a lot of built-in advantages in any election that I'm not sure would be solved by term limits.
Yeah, who built them in? Okay, we're going to have to take another quick break, and we will come back. This is clearly a lively topic of conversation. I'm Celeste Headley. This is Hear Me Out.
Hi, I'm Katie Riley. On the Slow Newscast from Tortoise, Donald Trump became the first former U.S. president in history to face a criminal trial.
The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records.
This is not a trial. This is not an act of criminality.
We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct.
This is the story of his first week in court, told through the transcripts. Listen now to the Slow Newscast wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Jerusalem Demsis. I'm a writer at The Atlantic. And my beat, in many ways, is to challenge the conventional wisdom. I've written about how the problem with local democracy might just be too much voting, about how some environmental laws actually squash green energy development, and about how maybe the big demographic question of the day isn't overpopulation, but underpopulation. My new show is called Good on Paper. It questions what we really know about popular narratives with a new guest every Tuesday. Find and follow Good on Paper from The Atlantic, wherever you get your podcasts.
Good to have you back. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headley, and today we're talking about whether or not we should term limit people in the House of Representatives and people in the U.S. Senate. Before you mentioned the fact that there's precedent for age limitations, I would argue there's precedent for term limits. I mean, they were there in the Articles of Confederation. That's what governed the United States in between the Continental Congresses, right? It didn't make into the U.S. Constitution, but that's not necessarily because people thought they were bad for democracy.
Right.
Right? That's not why they didn't make it in. But we had term limits between that would have been the 1780s, the Articles of Confederation.
Right. That's definitely true, Celeste, except I don't know if that's our best model for government. I mean, I
don't know if the Constitution still is, but keep going.
Oh no, trust me. Well, and that's an important point too, which is that based on the constitutional law that we do have in this area, it does appear as though term limits are currently unconstitutional for Congress, right?
Wait a second. The Supreme Court decided in U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, which was 93?
Yeah.
That was, something like that, that states can't impose additional restrictions like as term limits on representatives in the federal government beyond those provided by the Constitution. Right. So constitutional term limits can only be imposed via constitutional amendment.
Right.
I'm not sure that's, I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, but I would imagine, I have spoken to some who say it's not clear that that's really what that Supreme Court decision says.
Right. So Congress could try, right? So so what this is saying, right, is that states can impose these additional limits beyond what the U.S. Constitution says. But Congress could try to do this, and members of Congress do introduce these term limit bills.
It
every
was in
year.
The Contractor Through America.
Right. They don't, and they don't go through for reasons that I think are pretty clear. It's Congress is not likely to limit their own length of service. They all think they're doing a great job, I'm sure. But so it seems at least possible that it would require a constitutional amendment to pass anyway, which again is not a reason not to try it, right? There are plenty of things I think should be constitutional amendments that would need to go through that way. But I'm not sure that just because it was in the Articles of Confederation means it was a good idea. A lot of stuff in the Articles of Confederation didn't work out too well, but we won't blame term limits for that.
No, we won't. So we only have a few minutes left, and there's still so much to say. So let me go back to this idea of limitations of any kind. And I say that because I cannot get away from the fact that politician has become a job. And I think that there's lots and lots of different reasons why the U.S. isn't really a representative democracy right now. But this is one of them, that we have it set up in such a way that incumbents are so safe that they no longer have to care about what public opinion is. And I really think that's part of what's driving the fact that these things that the majority of Americans support, we cannot get through Congress. If we were representative democracy, that would not be true. And part of this reason is because politicians get into Congress and then they sit there like a toad for decades, raking in, apologies, I'm a journalist, and if there's one thing I'm biased against, it's our current political system, because I see the sausage being made, and it's ugly, right? You have people who sit there for decades and decades. They are not answerable. Sometimes they don't even have to literally answer questions from their constituents, getting wealthy, and completely ignoring what anybody in the United States or specifically in their own districts care about.
So here's I share your frustration, right? As someone who loves Congress, I want it to be good, but I worry that putting in term limits would make almost all of the things you just said much worse. So I think, if you're putting a ticking clock on members of Congress, you're just asking for bad representation. So for one thing, the political scientist Gerald Wright, he found that term-limited lawmakers in state legislatures, so those who are in their last term, legally prohibited from running for re-election, they exert less legislative effort in that last term. They check out, right? They miss more roll call votes compared with their colleagues who are up for re-election. They basically get like legislative senioritis because they don't have to face the voters again. And there's also some evidence from a 2006 paper by John Kerry and his co-authors for what we would commonly call a Burkean shift, meaning that when legislators are term limited, they don't have to face the voters again, they no longer have any incentive to stick to what the voters want. They're even less beholden to the voters' wishes and more beholden to other concerns, like, for example, what job am I going to get afterwards now that I can't be in the legislature anymore? Elections are a ticking clock too, right? But the very nature of elections is that they incentivize, or at least should incentivize, listening to voters and doing their jobs in a way that makes voters want to reelect them. It's an accountability mechanism, a way of enforcing good representation. This is why we have elections. And so, one of my hobby horses is lamenting sort of how we kind of trash members of Congress for wanting to get reelected. Another way of putting this is that they want to please their constituents and provide them with good representation, so they'll select them again. Like, members should want to get reelected, because if they don't, then what's their incentive to listen to the voters at all? And so my thing is, if we put in term limits, we're still going to have, and this is to the yes and kind of thing that I think we would probably need, is that if we just put in term limits with nothing else, then we're still going to have the problems with our elections and the bad incentives that come from that, except we'll have fewer elections and fewer opportunities for voters to weigh in however they can, even if it's in this really flawed way that we've been talking about.
And we were just a couple minutes left, and I want to give you the last word, but I will say that there are lots of ways to continue serving a constituency, even if you're term limited out. Let's say that the term limit for a U.S. congressperson became 3 terms, right? 3 times 4, that's 12 years, which I think is kind of reasonable. And
well,
then
it's 2-year terms, so it would be 3 times.
Oh, right.
Two,
3 times 2. Right. Exactly. So, but let's say they term limited out of Congress and then they ran for a Senate seat. They are not. Then they don't have kind of the incumbency, but they still have that name recognition. They probably have a pretty big war chest. They probably have a good chance to go part of the Senate, and they have a better chance at getting in because the Senate would be term limited as well. Once they term limit out of the Senate, let's say that the Senate has also 3 terms, which is a very long time. Then they can move on. If they're not going to run for president, they can try to be in the cabinet. There's all kinds of other ways to be a public servant and serve in politics. They can go back to their own state and run for governor without sitting in one particular seat and oftentimes just becoming a block. We have so many examples of politicians who have become a block to progress and a block to the change and a stymied the changes in public opinion that I feel like it's at least worth giving it a go. And then let me give you the last word.
I totally hear that, Celeste. I think of the district, the congressional office, as something that's bigger than the individual member, right? We often call it a legislative enterprise. The job is to make good policy, to hear district concerns, all the things we think of as being in their job. And the member of Congress is the CEO of that enterprise, right? They're in charge of how to run the office and provide that representation. I don't know of a lot of businesses that do well when they're constantly having turnover with their leadership, right? It causes uncertainty, breaks momentum towards important goals. And a lot of policy goals that Congress has can't be accomplished in just a couple of years, can't be accomplished in just a few years. So, I think if you did this in any other line of work, it wouldn't be a great move. And I guess just in my view, in a lot of ways, Congress is no different.
Okay, fair enough. It is an argument that goes on, and I would say it was more relevant, except that do I think we could get a bill through Congress to establish term limits? No, I do not.
I think that we can agree on.
Yes. Charlie, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Celeste. Thanks for having me.
I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on this subject, and I know you have them. I have yet to talk to anybody who doesn't have an opinion on term limits. So please send us your thoughts. Last week, we had Barry Maura on. He argued that colonialism never really ended. There was a lot to unpack in that topic. Some of you picked up where we left off. So before we go, we want to share an email that we got from one listener. And don't know for sure how to pronounce this, so I'm going to do my best. This listener, I think, is named Maura Currie. And they wrote this. Thank you for the show. It was very illuminating. By the way, there are at least a few examples of classical European colonialism that still exist today. I was hoping the case of France and New Caledonia, or the U.S. in Guam, or Hawaii for that matter, would come up. Indigenous peoples in many places continue to work for independence from their colonizers. Thanks, Maura Currie. I could respond to some of those things, but that may be a conversation for another time. Maybe this is a conversation that needs to continue. Again, we really love hearing from all of you, so let us know what is on your mind. The address is hearmeout@slate.com. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Slate Audio. None of them are term limited. I'm your host, Celeste Headlee. Until next time, speak your mind but keep it open.